Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate the release of Lori Tobias's new memoir, Storm Beat, a journalist reports from the Oregon coast. I'm Marty Brown from Oregon State University Press, and I want to thank the Denver Women's Press Club for sponsoring tonight's event, and Sally Kurtzman and Mary Winter for moderating. Before I hand over the virtual podium, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. You're welcome to turn your cameras on if you like to be seen, but please do keep your microphones off so that we don't have feedback issues. If you have a question for Lori during the presentation, please type it in the chat window. I'll be monitoring that chat window and passing your questions on to Sally and Mary. We'll leave time at the end of the hour for questions and answers. We will be recording tonight's event and we'll post it to our YouTube channel after this event, probably tomorrow. We'll also stream live on Facebook. So keep that in mind if you don't want your face up there on the camera. For many of you, Lori Tobias needs no introduction. She's a veteran journalist who freelances for local and national outlets, including the New York Times, Seattle Times, Denver Post, and 1859 magazine. Storm Beat is her first book of nonfiction. Her novel Wander won the Nancy Pearl Book Award for Best Book of Fiction from the Pacific Northwest Writers Association. And with that, I am going to turn off my camera and be monitoring the chat window. Again, please send your questions through chat. And I will turn the evening's proceedings over to Sally and Mary and Lori. Thank you again.
Thanks, Marty.
Thank you, Marty. And welcome everybody to a Denver Women's Press Club virtual program. As you know, with COVID, we're all closed down, so we're very happy to be able to share our members, as Lori is a member, and share the distinction of what she's bringing us tonight. So we're very happy to have you all here, and glad that you could join us. The Denver Women's Press Club, for those of you who don't know, was founded in 1898. So we're 120 some years old. And Lori has put, no, I was going to make a joke, but I won't. But we're all happy to have her here. And I would like to read just one thing before Lori starts, because I met Lori and she treated me like a writer, and which I wasn't. But I love this in her book. She says, "The world of writing, of books and of newspapers, of how we read and where we read is changing. It's changing so fast, it's hard to imagine what exactly we'll be left with. But we will always have our stories. Of that much I am sure, and that I'm able to craft a life sharing those stories and so many others is a privilege and an honor, and I give thanks for each and every day." And I think, wow, I mean, that's wonderful. And as a writer, that she can tap into the here and the now and pull it together. So it's a pleasure to have you all here. And Mary, do you want to take the next part and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Mary Winter, and I am here because I'm just a huge fan of Lori's and always have been. Ever since she stumbled into the Rocky Mountain News newsroom in 1997, a century ago. No. You were fresh from the Colorado Lifestyles magazine, I recall, and we had just launched Homefront, a Sunday section, and we focused a lot on homes and decor. And as I recall, this was a big initiative. We were in a big circulation war with the Denver Post, and we were trying to appear a little more upscale and attract a few more upscale writers. So that's why I think, Lori, you wrote about debutantes eventually, and some other assignments that seem kind of odd now, don't they? But anyway, I followed Lori's career. She stayed with us about 3 years at the Rocky and moved on. And anyway, what I remember about you, Lori, is all business. You came in early in the morning before anybody else. You were at your desk. You were focused. You were organized. I just was smitten immediately. You had story ideas. I mean, you were a gem. So anyway, we muddled through on those home stories, and that's the background and the context. So some of this will make sense, I think, when you read from the book later. But anyway, let's quit talking about you and talk about me. That's a joke. Tell me this. You write that you love Denver and you know, had a wonderful run here. Why exactly did you leave in 2000? What made you pack up and go to such a different spot like the Oregon coast?
Well, one, and this sounds flippant, I don't mean to flip, because I could. Chan was a lineman, and he was what they call a tramp lineman. So tramp linemen follow the big jobs. They follow the storm work. They don't interview. Well, if they're union, they don't interview. You just call the hall and say, hey, do you need a journeyman lineman? And if they do, you go. And so we did that for 15 years. And I was so used to going on to the next thing. And I've always wanted to live on the Oregon coast. What I didn't really know was how badly it was going to hurt me to leave Denver, hurt me emotionally. I left and I was devastated. I didn't even know if our marriage was going to survive. But it was different too, because we weren't doing the tramping thing. This was going to a utility where you sign on and you stay. You don't just run off every 5 minutes. Although, believe me, Chan tried. And I had wanderlust in me. I spent my first 18 years of my life in the same place and then went to Alaska like 6 months out of high school and suddenly had this awareness of how big the world was out there and that I could have it. I could have any part of it I wanted. I could be anybody I wanted in my little small claustrophobic central Pennsylvania town. That was not a notion. You know, I grew up 3 houses down from where my father was born and raised. The idea of just running off and seeing the world just was not a concept. So at 18 years of age, fresh out of high school, when I learned that, I just wanted to keep going. And to this day, I'll look at Chen and say, you know, do you think we should move? And he'll be like, why? Where are we going? And I mean, I don't know. Maybe we could go to Maine. Maybe we could go, you know, I think it's always going to be in me. But like I said, I paid. It took me years to get over. Every morning I would get up and I'd open the Rocky on the computer. And Chan would say to me, Lori, we live in Oregon. I know, but I just want to see what's happening. And I didn't come back to Denver and see anybody for 7 years because it would have just been too hard on me. You know, it just would have been, it would have broken my heart to leave. Best friends in the world I ever had, that's the truth.
Yeah, yeah.
I even missed, you know, Chen used to drag me to the Broncos games and we'd go to the Avalanche and every once in a while we'd go to the Rockies and I would sit and read. I mean, I could care less, but I missed that stuff. I missed how we would get invited. I know, I see John over there and he's probably going to go, you weren't supposed to be doing that. We would get invited to all the black tie events and the openings and we'd go off and it was great fun. But it was, I don't think you'd ever have those times again. I can't even imagine. Sometimes I tell people about our book section. I can't even believe we had that book section, much less the travel section. And every week, it's sad, but it's, you know, that's the way life goes.
What was it like transitioning to travel writing for a while? Did you feel kind of footloose and did you enjoy travel writing?
I enjoyed flying first class. I enjoyed staying in the best hotels. But let me tell you something about travel writing. They know you're traveling free. They know they're putting you up. And there's always that tour guide. Man, you are going to, they drag your nose around from 6 a.m. till midnight. And I tell this story in the book. One time I was in New Orleans for the Tennessee Williams Festival and I was sick. I was sick beyond. And I said, I just can't make this dinner tonight. She said, oh no, it's a command appearance. Make this dinner. And I appeared. And you know, you're away. I've spent, I don't know how many days in Australia and they put me up at the Grand Hyatt, and all marble and all this, but you're alone. You know, it's not like your husband's there to enjoy it with you, you're alone. And I have some good memories. I drank a octopus martini in Adelaide, Australia, and was sick for 2 days. We were flying over this body of water at like 8 o'clock at night in the dark, and there was me and a woman from the James Beard Society, the pilot in front of me, and a Chinese woman who gave herself the moniker of Belinda Sunshine. And all of a sudden, the woman sitting next to me from the James Beard Society grabs me and she says, in this Bronx accent, "What's the matter with the pilot?" I said, "What do you mean, what's the matter with the pilot?" She said, "He's slumped over the wheel." And I look, and sure enough, he's like this. I grabbed him by the shoulder. I said, "What's the matter with you?" Because all I could think of is I don't have the kind of spine to get up and take the radio for help. No, that's not going to be me. And so he sits up really slowly. He turns around. And he says, "I was writing in my log by the dash light." We got off the plane. We gave him all of our swag. He said I scared him so bad he thought he was going to wet himself. So yeah, I have memories, but travel writing isn't what everybody thinks it is.
Mm.
Talk a little
Lori,
bit.
I liked one of your comments. Oh, sorry. You can tell Mary and I have practiced this. You said at one point, when the work ends, the story doesn't. Does that mean the story follows you, or that you're always thinking about it, or how does that work out?
Well, I think I meant that it is always with you. The worse the story, the more it stays with you, unfortunately. But what happens is, I had to learn this, is because covering the coast, there's a lot of tragedy. And this is a beautiful place, but it's also rugged. And so there's a lot of capsizing, people falling off the headlands and whatever, and getting washed out to sea. And what I figured out was when you're on deadline, sometimes I had to be my own photographer, and your notebook and your camera and the fact that you're on deadline and you've got to get the story, those are all kind of act as buffers, I think, so that you're aware that something horrible has happened and you're aware of the enormity of it. But it's only when you file your story and the editor says, "Okay, we're good," that you sit down and you realize, for me, that came the moment where it would hit me. And emotionally, I would just go, "Oh my God," those poor people. And sometimes it would be like 3 o'clock in the morning, and sometimes it'd be in the middle of a TV show 2 hours later. And, but they do stay with you. And this beat, one of my friends wrote something and said that she wondered about the toll this took on me emotionally to cover these for so many years. And I hadn't thought of it that way, but I'm sure it did take a toll on me.
Lori,
Mhm.
I know I wanted to ask you about your habit of journaling every night, and whether you were born that way, or whether it's fun for you. Is it therapy for you? I've just always admired how I wish I would have done it. It's one of my huge regrets in life that I didn't keep a journal of, my 20s when I had fun and things like that. I've heard other people say that too, but how do you develop that? How do you do that? Do you make yourself?
I honestly I don't have to make myself. And the harder my life is when things are going bad, if I've just lost someone or whatever, if I'm struggling, the more I write in my journal. So sometimes it's not every night, and sometimes if it is every night, and sometimes a whole week will go by. I think it's how I process things. I don't know if it's a learned behavior, but I think it really is. And sometimes it's really mundane. I mean, really mundane, like, got a new TV and the old set doesn't, the old stand doesn't work. I mean, just stupid stuff. And sometimes it's really introspective and just trying to make sense of the world and what's going on. And but I've done it since I started when I was like 13 or 14, and then I really didn't do much. And if you want to have some fun, read what you wrote about yourself when you're 13 or 14. There's an eye-opener. Or it makes you run for the garbage can. But then somewhere in my late 20s, I got really serious about it, and I did it every day. And so now I have journals from 1986. I actually just threw a couple years away, and I'm going through those 1 year at a time to come up with my next memoir, which is about being married to a tramp lineman.
Great idea. I look forward to it. One other kind of related question. I'm always interested from writers, what is your daily habit? Do you have to lash yourself into your chair like a couple hours every day? Or do you get up really early, or have a word count deadline?
No.
How do you operate?
One of the things, it just depends where I'm at in the process. I hate rough drafts. I absolutely hate the blank screen. I love revising. And so when I'm in a rough draft stage, I have to lash myself to the chair, and I have to keep myself off Facebook, and I have to quit playing solitaire, and I have to not go check and see what everybody else is on. It's a struggle for me. And I'm usually on deadline for a story. So there's this juggle. So I used to, with when I was still at the Oregonian, I would write for the Oregonian at 3 o'clock. I would, if I could, if I wasn't, on deadline, I'd sign off and I would have a couple hours for like Wander, my novel. And then when I worked on this one, I had been laid off. So it was juggling, earning a living, getting out there, getting the freelance assignments and making time for this. And right now, doing the research for this next book, honestly, I sit and look and go, am I even going to be able to write another book? So the first draft is not fun for me. But like I said, I love to revise.
Mm-hmm. But you.
Mm-hmm. But Lori, and I want people to know that the book Stormbeat is not just column. It's really presented on ideas, and each chapter kind of has a different idea that you had. You had a very terrifying experience in a helicopter followed by a huge siege of vertigo. Are you over that? Was that just a one-time shot, or
no,
are you
I think
bungee jumping now, or what?
I'll have vertigo, I think, for the rest of my life. It comes and goes. And it's kind of, I think it's a little bit funny in the book, but I was terrified. And the fact is the bar pilots had talked to me about, they wanted me to write about them. So they want to impress upon you how hard their job is. And so after I flew with them, they said, well, hey, the other way we board ships is we take our boat out. It's since been updated. They have this amazing, amazing boat. And they motor up to the side of these humongous cargo ships, and they climb up the rope ladder onto the ship. And then when they're done, they climb back down and they jump onto the waiting boat. And I had considered doing that. I had really considered doing that, which thank God I didn't. I mean, and then somebody else said to me, like a year or two later, there were some scientists suggested I could go with them to Antarctica. And they were telling me about they board the boat the same way, the ship the same way. And he says to me, and if you fall off, you will die. I'm like, oh, goody. I know this is how I wanted to end my life. And it didn't go any further. But in the beginning of my beat on the coast, there was probably very few things I would have said no to if it meant getting a story. Because I guess I had to prove myself. I mean, I'd been a features writer. I had a column. And now I was writing news. And it felt foreign to me. I didn't always feel up to the task. So if there was something I could do to kind of prove myself, then I was going to overcome my fear and prove it.
That kind of a related question from Maryland. What was your beat? This is from Maryland, and this is, what was your beat in Oregon? Did it include missing persons?
It included anything that happened on the coast that was breaking news and big enough to be a story. The Oregonian at the time was the biggest newspaper in the Pacific Northwest, including over the Seattle Times and the Post, because they were competing. They had the Seattle Times, they had the Seattle Post. In San Francisco, the same thing. So it was a big paper. And whatever was happening, it was mine. And so I literally covered 360 plus miles of the coast, and then sometimes up into Washington.
Wow.
No,
Go.
I have another question from Maryland, and I kind of had this one too. In this book, are there any stories you'd wish you'd covered or covered differently? I don't know if Maryland means the book, but anyway, just over your past, I guess, reporting career, can you think of any stories that you wish you would have covered and maybe, missed the opportunity, or is there a story you wish you would have covered a lot differently than you did?
It's kind of hard because usually the stories were pretty tragic. And so to say you wish you had been the one to cover it feels kind of selfish. I don't know if you guys remember the Kim family went missing in the Coast Range back in, it was like 2004, 2005. I had just signed on with the Oregonian. I'm pretty sure they won a Pulitzer for that. And I was in Alaska. I was out of town. There was one, I was in Belize, and it's like 6 o'clock in the morning. I get a phone call from one of my colleagues. She's like, hey, and I had just seen all these alarms, and there was a shooting of a cop, and I'm in my hometown, and I'm trying to make sense of it. I had a new phone. I didn't really understand how everything was working. And I said, yeah, I just saw that. And she said, well, how fast can you be there? And I'm like, well, not worried. I'm not, fast, I'm in Belize. But so I didn't, that was probably the biggest manhunt that ever occurred on the Oregon coast. And so I missed the first days of that. But then when I got home, I wasn't even home, and my editor was calling me and saying, hey, we need you to pick this up now and move on with it. And the manhunt went on forever. They never found the assailant, found his dog. But so that felt a little bit, anybody who's a journalist will understand what it's like to have this breaking huge story be happening and you're missing it, and it's your beat. I mean, there's a territorialness about this. Having said that, I loved Belize so much, I didn't really care.
Yeah, good.
Might have been a sign I was burning out.
How about stories for this particular book, for Storm Beat? Did you have to edit a lot out? Was it hard to decide what stories to include and which not?
Well, I just gave myself this rule. I couldn't include anything, or most anything, unless there was something about it that hadn't appeared in the Oregonian. So I wasn't just going to rehash a new story. It had to be either there was something the readers would never hear, because that's just not what you put in a newspaper. There was something going on in my life when I covered it. There was something about covering it. So that was kind of my litmus. And that, for that reason, a couple stories didn't make it into the book that I wish now would have.
Did you run a lot by Chan? Did he help you, Ed?
Well, Chan worked at the utility, and all the fellow linemen had been here forever. They were the town gossip. So they knew everything that was happening to everybody. So every once in a while, Chan would call me and say, hey, did you hear this really happened? He said, hey, did you hear 3 people died on such and such on the bar, on the Umpqua bar? And I'm like, no. And he goes, well, they did. And I'm like, well, I didn't get anything. And so I go looking through my email and I see a press release from the Coast Guard. But what the press release says is 2 rescued, and so but I know that Chan knew what he was talking about. These guys are all locals. They've been here forever. If they say it happened, it happened. So I call my editor and she says, no, I'm looking right at the press release and it says 2 people rescued. And so we were reading it together, and it's like the last line says 2 found dead, 1 missing. So there were 3 people in this capsizing. And it would have went right by us if he hadn't called and said, I think it was kind of like him saying, hey, why aren't you on the road covering this story?
Is he a good editor?
Chan?
Yeah.
Oh, good God, no.
Okay, we'll move on.
He is not a communicator. He's a good person to bounce things off as, what do you think of this story? Or he's good in that way, but no, he's not an editor. No, he's totally not an editor.
So we have a question here from Jenna. She wants to know, is that you on the cover of Storm Beat?
Jenna, I'm going to tell you what I told Mary Winter when she asked the same question. My butt hasn't been that small since 6th grade. Oh.
I just answered my own question. It says I stock photo, so apologies.
Well, no, the little one on the back is me, but the woman from the back, no. That unfortunately is not me. But I'm glad you've given me the opportunity to clarify that.
It's a cute jacket.
Yes, that is a very cute jacket.
It says that Chan took the picture.
Chan took the picture on the back.
No, not Chan.
The little mugshot on the back.
Oh, that's the one on the back.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I would like to ask that I think, would-be journalists need to kind of realize, and I know that we have quite a few writers with us, is that you said that even after a terrible accident where you were talking to the family and they'd lost family members in a crash or whatever, how invasive it felt to go in and to talk to them. But you realized then that they needed to be heard, that they wanted their story out, and that you would just ask it very politely and quietly, and then you just let them talk. And I think sometimes we tend to jump in, and how do you feel, and what's going on, and sometimes it's good to just say, tell me how you're doing, that kind of thing. Did you find that hard when you had to deal with some of those situations?
Oh, I absolutely hated it. I hated it, and I never stopped hating it, but I started understanding it because there came a time, I would always apologize. I would always, for intruding, acknowledging what a hard time this was. I was sorry for their loss. But there came a time when there was a really bad traffic accident on I-5, and not even my beat, but I got drafted to help do the story because there were like 4 fatalities or something, and there were people, I think they were with the symphony. And I got a hold of one victim's husband right away, and it had been, it was a drunk driver or a wrong way driver or both. And he wanted to talk about his wife. He really wanted the world to know who she was and why she mattered and what his loss was. And once you understand that, and if you can approach it right, then you realize you can do a service and you can help them. And that was about as true as it's ever been when a woman threw her son off the bridge here. Our bridge is like 130 some feet tall, and he was autistic, and she just lost it and threw him off the bridge. And I was not on staff anymore, but they texted me and asked me to go out and cover it. And I just said, no, I can't do this. But because it meant knocking on doors of people who were suffering hugely. So what I did do, though, is in time, I reached out to the boy's father on social media and said, if you ever want to talk about your son, I'm here. And he did. He wanted, and so we did a Father's Day story, and he talked about why people with disabilities deserve to live a full life too, and that nobody has the right to, I have huge admiration for him. I don't know how he has gotten through what he has, but he's used it to be a spokesman for grieving parents, for disabled children or developmentally disabled children. And I'm glad that he felt the trust to let me share that story.
Switching gears here, Estrus wants to know, did you ever have to cover any stories that had to do with the Twilight movies?
No, because Estrus, that's up in Washington, and that would have been the entertainment beat. And I did cover when they did the story of the young man who they found in the bus in Alaska.
Oh, yes.
Sean Penn came out and filmed that in Astoria. And I went looking for the film crew, and I walked there's a beach up in Clatsop County where you can drive on the beach. There's not many out here, but you can. I don't know how many miles I logged on that beach looking for them and didn't find them. But I was so tired, I literally hitchhiked back up the beach and got a ride because I just couldn't walk anymore. But I never did find them. And I actually turned that story into my quest to find them. But no, I never did Twilight.
I just wanted a lighter note.
Well, hey, can I read a little excerpt? And I think you might find this is a little lighter.
Yes, please.
Okay. I'm not good at reading. I have to put on my readers. If I go too fast, just yell at me. It's kind of a bad habit I have. The Rocky was my first major metro daily. I was hired for a new Sunday section home front, and as badly as I wanted the job, I was also scared to death. My editor, Mary, who I would come to think of as my surrogate big sister, assigned fellow reporter James Meadow to be my newsroom buddy. He promptly put the notion to rest, explaining he didn't do the buddy thing, especially not the tour of the building, but if I needed anything, to let him know. My beat was home decor, or more accurately, writing about very rich people's homes with indoor bowling alleys and outdoor heated pools by mountain resort ski runs, old Denver mansions with massive fireplaces in the kitchen and carriage houses in the back. Soon I had my own column, also about homes, though the concept could be stretched a lot of different ways. I wrote about the parade of homes and the Denver Junior Symphony show house, always grinning just a little to myself at the irony. Me, the daughter of a mother who could probably not have defined interior design, hanging with the well-heeled. Sometimes, though, I hated the beat. The snottiness, the easy money, the egos, the blatant appeal from designers and design shops for stories in the paper, even though they were above advertising in our tabloid-sized Rocky, opting instead for the Tony home magazines. The Rocky's size made it both ugly and belittled. Some associated it with the tabloids like the National Enquirer or worse. Once, as we sat at lunch with an architect we featured often, he admitted that his problem with the Rocky was that people thought of it as the newspaper for the working class. I considered stabbing him with my fork. I admit I was somewhat oblivious to the huge class divide in this country until I worked that gig. Oh, I knew there were the moneyed and the not. I just didn't quite get that if you were, say, a power lineman, you inhabited a lower rung on the ladder than, an attorney. even if you did make more money. Sometimes I got drafted to write for other editors in the feature sections. Once I wrote about installing a sprinkler system, another time about a survival race, and once a story about the Brazilian martial art capoeira. Estris, you were with me on that one. When news of the Columbine massacre broke, I was drafted to write a description of the school for the afternoon extra edition. I'd never seen the school, and to this day never have. Instead, on that afternoon, as we watched the story breaking live on the newsroom TVs, I called sources my colleagues shared with me, a coach, a former teacher, a neighbor, and let them describe the school. The Columbine shooting remains the darkest memory from my days in the Denver newsroom, but there are plenty of other stories that stay with me, though not necessarily for their newsworthiness. Few were more eye-opening than the debutante ball I was assigned to cover one spring, me and the Debs, an odder pairing I can hardly imagine, but there we were. My assignment was to choose one young woman to follow throughout the season while she learned all the proper form and function before the big night. I attended a fashion show and an early primer on curtsying, trying to figure which girl would make the best story. Soon I became very popular with all the Debs' mothers, particularly a woman we'll just call Buffy, who was married to a very rich and very powerful man and was, by all accounts, a bitch beyond compare. Buffy made a big play at being my friend, even hinting at a possible distant familial connection. But of course, what Buffy really wanted was for me to choose her daughter to follow and write about. I did not. Instead, I chose Martha, a young woman fairly new to town, recently relocated from Georgia, with a lovely family and all that Southern grace and manners. I followed her to the bridal boutique as she chose her dress from a storeroom of ivy and white taffeta and lace, some carrying price tags of $10,000, and this was pre-2000. And I began to learn about the makings of a debutante, about waltzing, drinking tea, posture, and speech, and all the kinds of things they don't teach you in public schools. I learned the 4-point curtsy, in which the Deb puts her left leg behind her right, bends to receive her tiara, then straightens and brings her feet together. The story was not without its detractors, for obvious reasons. The entry fee alone was $1,500, and while the debutante organizers insisted it was good grades, leadership, impeccable manners, and community involvement that earned the girls an invite, I doubt I could have found one young lady whose family were not members of one country club or another. And the Debs, of course, loved the whole fairy tale experience. Truthfully, it was kind of fun, in an ironic, thank God this is a one-time thing kind of way. On the eve of the ball, we sat outside the country club on rows of folding chairs as the skies turned dark and the air grew moist and everyone prayed it would not rain. It never did, the organizer insisted, as if to suggest that even the elements knew better than to rain on the debutantes' parade. Someone handed out hefty leaf bags, and soon the first drops fell. The Debs were protected beneath the roof, but the rest of us had to suffer. They hurried through the ceremony, and finally we all moved inside to dry out. I was talking to Martha's mother. Suddenly there was a hand on my shoulder, followed by a shove. "You're in my kitchen now," Buffy hissed. My work finished, I left a short time later, and that was the end of my inclusion in the world of debutantes and their mothers, or almost the end anyway. My story ran a few days later. I was proud of it, proud of having figured out how to write about a world as foreign to me as Mar-a-Lago. The morning it ran, I couldn't resist calling the Debs' mother. Polite as ever, but in a voice worried and small, she reported she had been unable to leave her bed after seeing I'd quoted her on the exorbitant cost of the ball gowns. Apparently the country club set would not be quite so welcoming in the coming days. Nor was my own newsroom. I soon learned my story was the subject of a morning radio show ridiculed and rejected as elitist bullshit, and I was presumed one of the country club set, ridiculously out of touch with reality. Even some of my colleagues joined in. For a few short hours that day, I belonged nowhere, not with the working class journalists I called friends, and certainly not with the debutante crowd. It didn't last long, but it hurt. Over time at the Rocky, I grew sure, though I never stopped studying the writers I admired. James and I were friends by then. We joked about judging the Miss America pageant, something we both did sitting before the TV with our pens and yellow legal pads, and we shared vegetarian recipes. He had had some health scares involving his heart and was changing his eating habits. I hadn't eaten meat, poultry, or seafood for about 5 years by then. I brought him my favorite vegetarian cookbooks and sought out others from the library. Soon he was bringing me recipes too. When I returned to visit in 2007, James was the one person I meant to see when I visited the newsroom. I saw him cross the room to his desk and thought he was my next stop. But then there was someone else to catch up with, and then someone else, and I left before I realized I'd never made it to his desk. Less than 2 weeks after the Rocky closed, I was in Mexico on the beach. I saw someone had tried several times to reach me on my cell. Just before we left, the Oregonian had announced more layoffs were imminent, but they would ask for volunteers first. So there I was with hordes of bikini-drunk spring breakers sipping and sunning, and there was the reality in the form of a caller I didn't recognize. The calls began at 9, the same time many of my editors arrived at work. I hit the callback button and listened to it ring as I watched Chan zip along the sea before me on a jet ski. I didn't know it at the time, but he was actually rescuing 2 guys who'd crashed their ski and were thrashing in the water, shouting for help. Hello, a woman answered. Hey, this is Lori. Were you trying to reach me? Oh, Lori, she said. It's Mary. Is this a good time? I laughed. Of course. I was always happy to hear from Mary. Lori, she said, I'm sorry to have to tell you this. James Meadow died.
Wow. Wonderful. Oh boy, we could just sit and listen to this all along. Everybody should know that there are some books available at Tatter Cover if you want to read some of her other stories, because they're just terrific. Your detail, your description, the honesty, the insideness is just terrific, Lori. This is
Thank
great.
you, Sally.
Do we have other
I do
questions?
I have,
Mary, do you have any questions here?
Marilyn still has another question.
Okay.
Kind of a, well, what's your biggest disappointment within journalism from when you started
Ooh.
until today? Besides, yeah.
Really, a lot of the disappointment comes from readers, of people being very mean-spirited and assuming, name calling, assuming they know our politics, assuming they don't really, I hate to say this, but they don't really treat you like people. I wouldn't even read my comments anymore on the Oregonian because they were so mean. But I have a friend who posted a review on Amazon, and this kind of didn't shock me. I just didn't know it. And she said my book changed her life the way she thinks of journalists, because she just always thought we were cold and all we cared about was getting the story. And that is so, I mean, getting the story is what we're charged with doing, but it's not because we're cold. And if you want to think about it, just imagine if nobody were sharing these stories. When I think about the stories I shared on the Oregon coast, and sometimes I'd catch grief. One time there was a surfer, new surfer, and his friends took him to surf, and it was 20-some foot seas, and he died. And I got a little grief for the way I handled the story, because I was pretty matter of fact about the fact that what was he doing at the most popular surfing spot on the Central Coast in 21-foot seas when nobody else was there, and didn't question why were there no experienced surfers there? My feeling was, if you don't share those stories, you don't teach people, and it's going to keep happening. If you don't say, don't cross this fence line on the headlands, somebody else is going to fall tomorrow. So being trashed, and I use that word, just being so, it gets really hard. That's one disappointment, a big one. And I know you got to take it with, consider the source, I guess. The other one was from the time I started in journalism down to the bitter end, there was always, not always, in truth, and I'm not just saying this because this is Denver, this was not so much the case at the Rocky, but almost every newspaper I was at, they didn't pay you overtime. And they didn't pay you, I had one friend in Connecticut at one of my first papers, and he actually believed, and he was a 2-time Vietnam vet. He thought he was, he acknowledged he thought he was invincible, but he believed that as a journalist, it was your job to work however many hours it took to get the story. And you couldn't expect to be paid for all that time. I just thought, this is bullshit. It's not like we're working for a charity. So that was disappointing, but truthfully, man, let me tell you something. If you don't think I feel blessed to have had the career I did, I absolutely do. I wouldn't have traded it for anything. Well, maybe a debutante ball, but
I have another one here from Jenna. What's the difference between writing fiction and nonfiction?
Fiction is really hard for me. So with nonfiction, you have a set of facts, and that's what you have to stick to. You can put your personal interpretation into them, your emotions in, depending the type of nonfiction. I mean, for memoir. In fiction, you can fly your protagonist to the moon tomorrow. That was the hardest thing for me, because there's no limits. You have to set your own limits. And with my first novel, the only way I finally got it done was saying, these are the facts of her life, period. This is what she does. This is who she's married to. These are the facts. And no, she can't fly to the moon tomorrow. I mean, fiction is very hard for me. And I have a book that's 90% done, and I've put several years into it, and I am finally at the decision that I need to just jettison it and move on. I just can't make it that as good as I think it needs to be. I mean, I probably could, but I don't have that many years in me. I mean, and maybe it's just that I'm not that good of a fiction writer.
I had another question for you, Lori. What story or maybe experience sticks with you most from your years in Denver?
Two. And it always happened after I had lunch at Tiwa's. Walking into that newsroom and seeing Columbine and seeing it play out on TV live and sitting next to Mark Wolf. And, you know, I was a features writer. I really had no part in the breaking news business. But what I recall, and Mary, you might recall this, and this is still hard for me to relate, is Mark was my pod mate. He sat there and I sat here. And he had this napkin and he was on the phone with, and Mark, you were welcome to chime in and correct me, but he was on the phone with somebody in the police force he was friends with who was very much in charge of what was happening. And Mark started drawing on the napkin and drawing X's where the bodies were. And that was the first time I think any of us, at least back in the features department, had any idea how many victims there were. And I remember jumping up and running to Mary. I always ran to Mary and saying, Mary, there's like, you know, however many people dead. Mark's writing this on the napkin. And it just being so surreal. I remember when I left that day driving home and the freeways were empty and I passed a bomb squad truck. And I remember canceling. I was supposed to go to some kind of yoga class. My husband was supposed to be doing some kind of kayaking thing, and everybody just stopped what they were doing. I think, in truth, that was one of the reasons I think that made me want to leave Denver. That and the JOA. And for those of you who don't know, JOA, Joint Operating Agreement. You know, the columnist across the street called us losers. It was so disheartening. And not knowing where it was going to go, not knowing if the Rocky was going to survive. It was a lot to take day after day. And that kind of, I think the JOA coincided pretty closely with the 1-year anniversary of Columbine. But I remember coming back from lunch from Tiwa's and there was the news of the JOA. It's like, I'm never eating at Tiwa's again. Tiwa's was this little Vietnamese place on whatever street we were on.
Federal.
Yeah.
Federal.
Thanks. Julie has a question.
Hey,
She
Jules.
writes, you paint an amazing picture of the Oregon coast. It sounds amazingly beautiful, yet rugged and sometimes brutal. Would you leave Oregon and come back to Colorado, given the perfect opportunity?
I can't imagine the perfect opportunity, but Julie, I'll tell you what, I would come back to Colorado for my friends. I'd come back for the city life. But what would stop me is I hate being landlocked. And so does my husband. It's not like I'm out swimming in the ocean. I mean, we do kayak in the bays and stuff around here. It's just that something about being around water for me is, it's almost like I need it. And we have looked at our ancestry and we both tend to come from places that are surrounded by water. And he's the same way. He's the same way. We both just gravitate toward places. I mean, to the point where if we're going to take a little trip, you know, take the dogs out for the weekend, we stay on the coast. We almost never leave the coast. And actually we did over Labor Day weekend and got stranded in the mountains by the fires. We couldn't get home. So that might've been the hint that, nah, Lori, just stay on the coast.
Oh.
I have one last question, unless somebody, no, good one here. From Judy, your experiences covering the Oregon coast reads like an edge of your seat TV series. Any plans to write a screenplay? Thank you, Judy.
No, and I'll tell you why. Writing is hard enough, and learning a new genre. I have friends who've gone back and forth. They write fiction, then they're going to write a screenplay, then they're going to write for this. I have found, for me, I need to keep my focus. And for me, that is fiction and creative nonfiction. Writing a screenplay is a whole nother animal. I have looked at doing it, And it's so different from writing fiction or creative nonfiction. It's not, when you write fiction or creative nonfiction or whatever, you're writing, at least I am, for the senses and for, description and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Screenplay is very cold and matter of fact, and then they did this, and then they did that, and you have to have all this direction and stage direction. And to learn to be adept at that, it's also, I've heard this forever. I mean, starting in college when I interviewed some people with the theater department, and I think she was like 42 and she was already lying about her age, because if you're beyond 35, nobody wants to talk to you. And I see that repeatedly. Having said that, if anybody ever wanted to come to me and turn this into a screenplay, boy howdy, yeah, we can do that. And but the other part of that is, if you want to make money, tell somebody you'll teach them how to write, start a contest for screenplays. It's really hard to navigate out there and know what's legit.
Another question? Sally? I had a question.
Oh, okay. Who said that?
I did.
Well, I have a question. Oh, you go. You do it.
No, you go.
You're the editor.
No. Well, this is about editing, though. And this is my last question. You've worked under a lot of editors now. What advice would you as a writer give to editors? Like, what's helpful to you? And, tough editors, I think, are the best. I would say that now. How would you respond?
So, Mary, you were good in that you nurtured me. Like, if I did something really boneheaded, you were never unkind or made me feel like I was never going to be able to write. You would be like, now let's sit down and let's work on this. What are you trying to say here? I remember one time in particular, because I was trying to get out of town on a ski trip and I was just about in tears. I had an editor, I was thinking about this, and she was really tough and she was really good. She made me a much better reporter. As much as I resisted it and she drove me nuts. I mean, it was nothing for her to call me 12 times on, within 40 minutes on one story, but I also realized she had a tin ear. And so you'd write something and you'd try to have a little lyricism or a little play on words, and you'd get the story back and it was like gone. You're like, wait a minute, you just lost the whole point of those sentences. And I'd say, well, didn't you hear oh no, I didn't hear that. And I also, to this day, and I've gotten used to it, but I talk about this in the book, I resist nut graphs. I resist nut graphs where you give away the ending of the story. Who the hell wants to read a story when you already know how it ends? I mean, come on. That drives me nuts. But you try to tell a news editor that and you're not going to get anywhere. And then I had an editor who I absolutely despised, and he's one of the reasons I didn't use names in my book, because I knew I couldn't name him. And I wouldn't have been kind. And I had another editor who was just as kind, and I've been blessed mostly with really good editors. But good editors, just because I also learned, just because the word editor is by their name doesn't mean they know jack about writing.
Mm-hmm. There was a good quote you said, Lori. You had been dealing with that nutcase who was trying to feed all the wild animals, and your editor kept saying, get back on the story, and you have to do this. And you said, after you hung up from some calls, you said, days like this, I just want to bleach my hair blonde and take up bartending. Were there days like that?
Yeah, but you know what? That wasn't because of my editor. That was because she was feeding black bears, and these black bears had at some point descended on a neighborhood and just decimated like a whole thing of I can't think of the name, heritage turkeys come into the dog door. They couldn't lock the doors on the barn because they were afraid the horses would get trapped in the barn with the bear. And she didn't know when to shut up. She kept calling me, and she wasn't doing herself any favors. The whole public was really against her, but she could not see what she was doing was wrong. And then at one point, the judge literally kicked her out of her house, said, you can't live in this neighborhood anymore. And I called her, or she called me, and she sounded so despondent. And she said, I don't know why I'm here if I can't feed the bears. And when I hung up the phone, I went, wait wait. She had a troubled life as it was. And the tone of her voice, I just suddenly said, oh my God, is she, what is she saying? And so I called my editor and he said, what do you want to do? Do you want to go and check on her? And I said, I know the road she lives on, but this is in a very rural area. I have no idea where that road's even at. And then I tried to call her back and her line was busy, which scared me even more. And that it just weighed on me. I finally got through to her and she's fine and we're in touch to this day. And she still doesn't understand what she was doing was wrong. But she had a hard life and that's what gave her some comfort and satisfaction.
Very good. Are there any more questions from the group, Mary, or from
I have
Marty?
one last one from Marilyn. Advice for
Okay.
anyone wanting to be a reporter in this day and age.
Make sure you know what the landscape is. Make sure it's a new game. And I don't know that unless you can get on with like the New York Times or LA Times or whatever, I don't know that it's that lucrative. I don't know that there's a lot of room at most places, not all, to write the longer in-depth stories that give you such satisfaction. It's a lot about how many clicks you're getting. And that's not very satisfying, but it's not all that, but you should know what you're going into and don't have misconceptions. And be aware that it's ever changing. It's ever changing even now. I can't even begin to see where it's going. But if you have that bug to be part of it, then, and you understand what you're going for, then yeah, go for it.
And are there places that they can get the book? I know we've got a few at the Tattered Cover. And what about the Oregon Press? Is that a good one?
Oregon State University Press, Tattered.
Yes.
Your independent bookstores will probably order it for you. And then, the big dogs.
Yeah.
So can I say something?
Sure.
So first of all, Mary and Sally, thank you so much for doing this for me and for your kind words. And for all of my friends, Denver, everywhere. I'm just so heartened by the support you guys give me. I mean, 20 years after I've left, that you would show up for this and support me. When Wander came out, I did a reading at the Tattered, and the room was packed with people I hadn't seen or talked to in forever. And the same thing now. And I just can't tell you how good it makes me feel and how grateful I am. That's the truth.
Well, I know everybody would love to see you if you ever came back. You must come back, You can go home again.
Yeah, yeah, whenever this surreal world we're living in changes back to normal, you probably can expect to see me. Because Denver is, to me, like I say in the book, the Rocky Mountain News was like my equivalent of a career hometown. I will always hold it near and dear, even though it's not there anymore. And so, and same with Denver, and same with the Denver Women's Press Club. What a cool, I don't know if you're not a member of the press club, if you realize this is, I think, the second oldest press club in the country. And we did such cool things when we weren't in COVID. I mean, the writers we had there, Richard Ford, Carolyn Kennedy, this place is such a treasure. And I'm not sure if Denver really understands what they have there. So, and we let men in too.
Well, yes, they do.